Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fighting Matters. I'm Stefan Kesting. I run grapplers.com. We've got Jeff Shaw, who runs Bellingham BJJ, and we have today's special guest, who's incredibly handsome, incredibly strong, incredibly good looking, and runs the History on Fire podcast, which I've enjoyed many times. Welcome, Daniele Bolelli.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, all those things are absolutely accurate. I'm glad you got that down.
I was reading off the script that you provided. I hope I got everything right. So, just something that was in the news a couple of weeks ago that maybe we can start with, because we didn't discuss it on the podcast yet, is that there's been sort of an exodus of academics from the United States who study fascism. We had Jason Stanley, Tim Snyder, and Marcy Shore, all of whom have written about and lecture on authoritarianism and fascism. They all basically fled the United States and moved to Canada, at least temporarily. That's kind of a canary running for the hills and trying to get out of the coal mine as fast as possible. Do you think that they're overreacting, Daniele?
No, I mean, it's heading in a horrible, horrible direction. I don't think there's much of an argument about that. I think part of the problem sometimes with political discourse has been that we use, it's almost become slander to use certain terms as opposed to actually, so people use fascist, communist, this as an insult, not as a, to me, it's like, no, let's look at what it is. Let's look at what exactly means to be one of these things. And if there are 15 things on the checklist and you check 12 of them, yeah, you probably are, you know. I remember it was actually funny once I did this thing exactly along those lines about what exactly are we talking about when we say fascism. And you've done similar stuff where we sort of highlights the key points. And I remember somebody commenting like, wait, but I like all those things. And I was like, yeah, so draw the conclusion, do 2 + 2 =, you can do it. It's like, and the reality is that other than in places like, if you go in Italy, yeah, there will be people who are fascist and proud to be. But in most places, people who are straight up fascist will never admit that they are fascist because it's been used as an insult for so long that they'll be like, me? No, I just happen to love authoritarian figures and this and that and the other. And just like, yeah, okay. But, as far as the direction where we're going, yeah, I think it checks a ton of the boxes that are required to meet the definition of fascism.
Well, that begs the question, what are some of the boxes that are being checked right now? That would be on the checklist of authoritarianism or fascism.
One of the cornerstones of fascism is the union of ultra powerful industries along with the state. So there's an authoritarian power of the state that goes hand in hand with the uber powerful industries. Well, we're seeing that in a pretty big way, where you literally have billionaires being handed the keys to part of the government. You have the beginning of squashing of opposition, whether it is in terms of journalism, whether it's judges, whether it's basically anybody who's an independent body who can put some of the checks and balances to authoritarian power. You have, and this is probably going to be more related to the stuff we're going to be discussing, you have this cult of like some bullshit version of masculinity where it's like we go back to traditional gender roles and this is what a man is and all of that. So on a cultural level, there's the crackdown on anything that doesn't fit a certain version of a tradition. That these are all things that check up, the whole idea. These are not as big as or as important as far as definition of fascism, but as far as, they still check the boxes being like major emphasis on fertility, on women, so crackdown on abortion, crackdown on certain women's rights, and so on and so forth. That has always been part of, I mean, back to Mussolini, paying you money, the more kids you had, kind of thing. I mean, we can go down the list, but there's a lot.
You and I have talked previously about this idea that fascism involves the idea of a rebirth, a return, like Nazism is a type of fascism. And it was not the First Reich, it was not the Second Reich, it was the Third Reich, harkening back to the era of basically the Bismarck era, the Franco-Prussian War, that was the Second Reich. and the era after Charlemagne, Louis the German, and that era back in the 800s. That was the First Reich. So it's this return to former glory. And I was in Rome a couple of years ago, and I saw a ton of the fascist architecture, and it's very clearly trying to channel the architecture from the Roman Empire. It's essentially trying to recreate the Roman Empire. Hey, let's go attack North Africa because that used to be our empire. And what does MAGA stand for again?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, make a
And that's exactly right. The Make America Great Again bullshit is exactly that type of stuff. It's the idea of we are going back to some glorious past where men were real men and life made sense and those pesky ethnic minorities stayed in their place and that kind of stuff. It's like there's mythological past where things were great, which of course, if you look back in history, it's like, exactly are we talking about where things were so great? But that's part of the appeal, and that's, yeah, you're absolutely right. On a cultural level, that's one of the biggest things about fascism is this cult of a tradition. Whether a made-up tradition or a real one remains to be seen, but nonetheless, this idea that we go back to when things used to be good, which is the same reason why you see every other right-wing jiu-jitsu guy who has in their profile pic on social media either a crusader or a Spartan, right? Or some kind of predatory animal. It's like the predatory animal is less to do with the past, but the other ones are clearly about, we are embracing that tradition. We are the heirs of the Crusaders, of the glorious Spartans, who are bisexual, by the way, but we forgot about that.
I love bringing up the fact that the army that finally beat the Spartans was the Thebans. And the core of the Theban army was the Sacred Band of Thieves, which were a bunch of split, like you had to be homosexual and you had to be there with your lover. So the Spartans essentially got smashed by the original gay pride parade. I love bringing that up. It
Yeah.
makes people mad.
Oh,
May it
yeah.
ever be so. And this is actually a great time to transition to talking about the role of spectacle and combat sports in this. And in one of your papers, you talk about the origins of the UFC and about how the use of Roman sort of imagery, as well as martial arts movie imagery and the cinematic things about strength and a return to, you mentioned Alessio Sakara, who has the tattoos. And what role does spectacle play in this sort of combat sports posing, like the profile pictures you talk about? What role does that play?
I think it's huge. I think part of the appeal is to try to, because I mean, realistically today, other than cosplaying as part of a militia, how are people gonna do it today or embrace that type of idea? Combat sport provide that because it's like a fantasy place where you can go into this we are true gladiators type of thing and reenact that. Ancient Rome was built on bread and games, and is a great way to keep the masses pacified. You have enough to eat. Here's some entertainment, and there was, and also ancient Rome was really a society that was built on violence. Violence was part of everything. So the entertainment was just an extension of everything else that they lived by. Romans didn't become the Roman Empire by being smarter than their neighbor or producing a better culture or creating some new religious insight. They became the Roman Empire by being better at violence than their neighbors. That's it. So that's what their society was built on. And so not exactly surprising that combat sport would latch onto that imagery.
And this is another parallel of our modern situation where you talked about the importance of the fantasy, right? And I think that a lot of people that crave authoritarian leadership have this idea of individual merit and the rugged individualist that earns everything with his own efforts. And they don't realize that, like, as you mentioned, Rome was better at violence than everybody else. They had access to resources that other powers did not have, similar to other fascist powers and modern United States of America, right? We would like to believe that we built this country with our own two hands when the facts show that it's just a lot more complex than that. And like, we'll get into the part where we talk about potential solutions later, but I'm wondering, as a historian, what do all these types of fascism have in common in your view, and what makes them different? Because clearly culture matters a little bit here too.
Of course, of course. I mean, on a basic level, you do have these, you know, fascism is a subset of totalitarian movements. So you can have totalitarian movements that are not right wing. You have like Stalinism is a left-wing totalitarian movement. I don't think that if you're under Stalinism, you really appreciate the difference between under fascism. It's like you're getting squashed no matter what by a totalitarian system that sucks. So totalitarianism is an aspect, but of course doesn't explain the whole thing. I think where it gets interesting as far as right-wing, characterizing it more directly as right-wing, I think is the union with private industry on an economic level. And then all the cultural stuff, some of which we are hinting at, that I think are what make the create the fascist status in that way.
Can you give some examples of the fusion of industry and state in the Italian and the German context of the
Yeah, I mean,
1930s?
yeah, fascism kind of was born in terms of the way it gained power. Because originally, the initial fascists were actually a left wing movement, but they started out, it was a group of 1,000 people whose ideology was loosely socialist. And then very quickly shift. Because one of the things about guys like Mussolini is that Mussolini never really cared about ideology. I mean, he makes it pretty clear. He says so. He says, I never care about any of this stuff. I wanted power. It's like, okay, well, that's honest, at least. It's and so when he realized that there was a way to have to climb the power hierarchy faster by switching completely the other route and go a right-wing direction, that's what he did. He got rid of most of the original left-wingers that were part of the initial movement and went from a movement that were like, you know, few people and their friends to becoming a mass movement. He did it when he became right wing. And part of the way, why was it easier to climb the power structure as a right wing movement as opposed to a left wing one? Because the owners of a whole bunch of industries at the time were dealing with worker strikes in a variety of different industries, mainly farming in the north, but not only. And so fascists would serve as muscle to just go beat up the strikers. And the owners of industry would go, thank you, my dear fascist. That was a real nice favor that you did for us. Now we're going to support you. Now we're in behind you. Now, so really fascism is born out of cracking down on the labor movement in northern Italy. And so that's how they build their alliances. That's how they make their money. That's how they attract new recruits and all of that. Which is why, by the way, when people, the Damascus, Dinesh, the Souza, or people like that are all like, fascism was a left wing thing. It's like, yeah, it's taking a grain of truth and intentionally misreading what was actually going on because that initial movement has nothing to do with what happens later, other than the fact that Mussolini was opportunistically trying to be part of both and then realize which horse to bet on to gain the best. That's it. Because at the core, he was born to serve industries where fascists would just beat the muscle and just beat up strikers.
What's frustrating in this messaging environment, because you brought up Dinesh D'Souza, is there's a lot of conscious misinformation. And
Mhm.
what's difficult for those of us that take part in public discourse and would like to think about rational conversations with other folks is you will have them both say, no, we're not fascists, the left is fascist, but then later also say, but fascism is actually good, which of course, and I often say Orwell didn't go far enough. And so I don't think we're yet to the part where we want to talk about countermeasures to this, but I'm curious if you could talk about that role of propaganda and how that played out in the 30s and how you see it playing out today.
I think today is even worse for one reason that I think up until recent times, there was a certain degree of consensus that we may disagree on the interpretations, but we agree on some basic facts.
Mm.
Now I think that ship has sailed quite a while. And that's why, the famous Trump quote, which I think really encapsulates perfectly the time we live in, I could walk down the street in the middle of New York City and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose a single vote. I think that's where it's at. I think the time for that kind of rational discussion, for some people, it's still there. But for a lot of people, I don't think there's a single rational argument that you could make somebody change their mind. I don't think evidence has anything to do with it at this point. I don't think rationality has anything to do. I mean, you're still seeing people who are losing everything because of horrible economic policies, who are still like, Yeah, but it's worth it. Yeah, I mean, if you think about without even having a policy issue, just in terms of like, look at what Trump messaged the other day about Bruce Springsteen, right? If you go back a few years ago, anybody, any political figure that would write something that deranged would be automatically lose a ton of credibility and support. Because again, not about policies, not even about politics. You could be super conservative and you look at this guy and you're like, wow, this guy has seriously lost his mind. He's batshit crazy. Maybe we don't go with this guy. We'll go with some other fascist who's more respectable and makes sense actually and all of that. But we can't go with this guy. The fact that somebody can write stuff like that pretty much on a daily basis, like Trump does, and people somehow think, no, no, I'm behind this guy. To me, that means we are so past the point of rational discussion that
I'm going to not disagree with you, but I'm going to say that a lot of his hardcore supporters never see that shit because every time that the Trump administration does something objectively horrific that would have been the death of any administration in the previous 200 years, I run over to Newsmax and I run over to Fox News, and it's not mentioned at all. It's this massive censorship that's happening all the time. So if your only news source was Fox News, all you would think is that there's all these incredibly grateful people thanking the president, and it's an entirely different information ecosystem, but there's also censorship. It's not just a spin control. It's not mentioned at all, ever.
some of that for sure, because you do get some of the people who only watch a particular TV channel, they are not going to get that. But then there are all the people who follow Trump in every which way on social media, so they get his messages directly from the source and they are gladly cheating. You know what I mean? So it's like there's that too, where it feels like the guy could say anything and it doesn't matter. So in that sense, Fox News is almost the voice of reason by censoring it because it's actually not feeding raw meat to a rabid crowd that would want it, you know. Because I mean, I think no, they are smart in the sense that they avoid losing those few people who are not aware that social media exists. So there's a percentage that probably can pretend to ignore what's happening because they only. But I think there's a much bigger percentage that just likes that stuff. That's into it.
So, I mean, although not the first time that I've said this, but the Nazis had the Völkischer Beobachter, the German newspaper, the Nazi newspaper that ended up becoming the propaganda arm of the Nazi party. Trump had Fox News and Newsmax, but I agree that the social media thing is incredibly important. And I don't think we can underestimate the effect of bots and trolls that's operating in that environment. I mean, everybody who's ever seriously looked at this has said that there are bots and trolls operating mostly in support of Donald Trump. I mean, guess what? The Russians are supporting Donald Trump, but they are also sometimes supporting the opposite just to create friction. That classic example of where they were trying to get an Islamic group doing a protest for the preservation of Islamic knowledge on the same corner on the same day as a bunch of Americans, like Texans against Sharia law. And let's have a protest for, against Sharia law. Let's have it at the same corner. And that ended up being tracked back to a troll farm in St. Petersburg.
Yeah, no, and that happens for sure. That's a huge element how you manipulate people. And then of course you're wondering, how much of it is paid trolls, and I think is a lot, and I think you're right. And how much of it is people are just that dumb. Because sometimes, I read like the range, in this case, on the other side of the spectrum. I read like some supposedly leftist takes that are so unbelievably stupid. They are like, okay, there are two chances. What I hope is that you are a bot that's pretending to be a leftist to create a backlash because nobody could be that dumb, or well, you actually are that dumb. And I'm hoping for the former, but I don't exactly. I think, like in many cases, it is the former, but not in all cases, because that's the other problem is that when you look at how people like Trump gain success, a lot of it is you shine the spotlight on the dumbest of the dumb on some other side. And so whoever is against them then automatically becomes the good guy in the eyes of a bunch of people.
The libs of TikTok strategy.
Yeah.
That's how it works, right? So it's not even about what you bring to the table, is the fact that you're against that bad boogeyman over there. And in some cases, again, some of them, the boogeymen are set up by bots, obviously. And in some cases, I think people are just dumb and they will come out with horrendously stupid takes that create a backlash and that starts spinning out of control. It's I think we were talking about way back when talking about Jordan Peterson, how Jordan Peterson was building his whole reputation, creating this boogeyman of this ultra liberal university thing. And now, do those people exist? Yeah, they do. However, and can they be as dumb as sometimes Jordan Peterson points out? Yes, but they are, very small percentage of the whole. He makes it sound like that is the whole. That is like that 1% of people who are absolute idiots are taking over all educational institutions. They are running the show. You now look through every possible instance of something fitting that 1% across the entire educational landscape. You only bring up those examples and suddenly you're making it feel like, oh my God, we're under siege. And this is the bad part of it, that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you do get some rabid wannabe fascist attacking certain things. And so if you are on the other side of the spectrum, you're like, I think in this case, quote unquote, my own guys are dumb, but those terrible people are attacking them. I guess I should kind of defend them. And before you know it, you start what used to be an extremist position within a field start becoming normalized because the other side attacks it. You know what I mean? And it's the dumbest thing we can do to ourselves on every level because, like the kind of thing that movements like the Nazis did, like the fascists, like Trump, seize on is find some boogeyman on the other side that's objectively pretty bad, and then making it look like they are an existential threat, making it look like they are a majority of what's on the other side. And then they are like, hey, we are your solution against this terrible stuff. And so that's, they're doing a good job at PR, and people who fall for it are doing their bidding.
Even irrespective of the scapegoating, which totally exists, go to Fox News every morning. Every morning, there is a story about a trans person playing an obscure sport like fencing. And every morning. And so these are people are set up to like, look, this is strange, different from you. And it's designed to stoke that anger. But I think another thing we're learning is how much confirmation bias matters because people want to believe what they want to believe. And so if you believe that you are set upon, that you're aggrieved, that your life is not going the way you want it to, and somebody proposes, hey, I can do it. You just have to, I can fix that. You just got to give me all the power. Then that can be appealing to some folks. And we always have to ask ourselves the question, who benefits? And getting back to the online bots stoking conflict and anger, I think one of the reasons that this administration has dismantled the online misinformation combating arm is because who benefits from chaos? The people that say they can solve the chaos, right? The people who benefits from a perception of rising crime and fear, even though crime rates are low, are historically low in America. And so I think that's part of the conscious strategy.
Well, and I think you brought up an absolutely excellent point that we forgot earlier, and is a key element of the growth of fascist movements is fear. They are largely built on fear of something that's about to happen, some boogeyman, something that only I can protect you against these waves of barbarians. And so the more there is fear, the stronger is the push toward authoritarian figures who kind of fulfill that, even psychologically, that kind of daddy figure who's like, worry kids, I'll handle it all. Just hang behind me and I'll take care of business. It's like authoritarian figures, whether they are political dictators or cult leaders, thrive wherever fear is. Because the more people feel lost, the more they feel scared, the more they don't know what's going to happen next, the more they will need somebody who looks reassuring, who looks the part of somebody who's like, no, this guy has it together. He can save us all. And that's what they all thrive on. And so the more that, the reality is there are very legitimate reasons for people being confused and scared. Our world is changing at a speed that most people can keep up. We do face a whole bunch of real threats on every level, whether you're talking about environmental problems, whether you're talking about changing technologies, the list is never ending of absolutely terrifying things that we're dealing with as a society. So, of course, people are going to gravitate towards some authoritarian thing. They're not going to go through the middle of the road, the centrist who's like, I think we should try this. However, there's also this other side. They want somebody who say, I got it all. Don't worry, guys. My 6-point plan is going to solve all your problems forever. Let me take care of it. That's what's appealing in time of crisis.
You brought up the boogeyman of the trans athlete. And
Uh-huh.
what that reminds me of is Daniele's countryman, Umberto Eco, in his famous essay on fascism, wrote about how the enemy has to simultaneously be very, very weak and very, very strong. So in the 90s, it was the cowardly, craven Jew who was hiding there more like a rodent than a person, but also controlling all the levers of power and also controlling the Soviet Union. It very, very weak, very, very strong. Trans athletes, these snivelly, uh, men pretending to be women, women pretending to be men. They're weak, they're not masculine, but they're also incredibly powerful. These academics, I'm sitting here this chat with two academics, these weak academics who've never lifted a weight, never thrown a punch in anger, never tried to choke anybody, never competed. These, sit there with their glasses but they're also controlling uh, everything. They're controlling the levers of power. They're controlling government. They're controlling the universities. This idea of very, very weak and very, very strong is embedded in the idea of the enemy.
100%. I think is on one hand you want to talk shit about the enemy. They are like they are beneath you, but on the other hand, if they are beneath you, well then you don't take them seriously. But no, we need to take them seriously because I'm the only one who can protect you. So they're also super scary, and that's part of the way it's done in terms of propaganda. I do think that in terms of the issues that we focus on, I think is we're making a gigantic mistake anytime we agree to play in the same play field that they choose. So, like the 10 zillion discussions about trans athletes, I think are completely suicidal for anybody who's trying to oppose the type of fascism creeping in with people like that. The same way as starting, every discussion, the kind of discussion that a random American who's not particularly politically aligned is going to be extremely unlikely to see any relevance to, especially when it's something that usually affects a tiny percentage of the population. Don't think those are the kind of issues we should shine the spotlight on, because that's where they win every single time. That's where they keep getting more and more supporters. And I think it's kind of like, speaking of universities, and the thing I hate is when people embody the stereotypes that the other side argue against. I'll tell you a weird story and then I'll connect it with what we're talking about. Back a couple of decades ago, I remember I was looking for an apartment. I was Long Beach, California, so not the most, pretty very diverse place in every which way. I walk up, meet the landlady. The first thing the landlady says is, I'm so glad you're not black. And I was like, okay. And she's like, no, 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 don't get me wrong. I like black people. They are great. I just, too many of them in the same neighborhood lower the property value, but I like them. The more she tried to explain how she wasn't racist, the more obvious it was how she was insanely racist. So far, okay, I can dismiss us as the crazy racist landlady. She had one African American tenant, this sweet older lady who was adorable and, lived there for a few years and then she died. Her family arrives to clean out the apartment. They clean out the apartment, and then her son goes into the communal laundry room, steal the laundry and the dryer, and run off. And the next day, I ran into the landlady who says, big smile from ear to ear, and is like, what did I tell you? This is what they are like. And I was like, Jesus Christ, this is what I hate. Like, these dumb bastard embodies exactly all the stereotypes she had believed in, and now she feels that she has more reason to apply that idea to anyone who's vaguely of dark skin color. And that's sometimes, occasionally, within academia, after I spend all my time seeing like people like Jordan Peterson are beyond the masses, then I look at some academics in the office next door and I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ, you actually fit the profile, it's like, so you do get that. And that's where I think speaking of possible solution, that's something that I seriously think strategically is important not to go play on the play field that some other guys choose and where they have obvious advantages, because the average American will pick whatever is against that one thing they don't like.
And today that landlady is a member of Congress from
Yeah,
Colorado.
probably. She's
Yeah.
in the housing department running, yes.
Yeah, right. The director of housing and urban development. Speaking of
Exactly.
solutions, as someone who runs a legit history podcast, you've talked about Jigoro Kano a fair bit. And I lived in Japan. I have some experience researching another form of fascism, Japanese imperial fascism. And Kano was one of the few public figures to really stand up and fight in a way that you look back on, and it would be ahead of its time. I think even today, I think that he was a man so far ahead of his time. And I'm wondering, when we can talk about Japan specifically, but what I'm getting at is like, we've talked about combat sports being part of the problem, but how can we, as people that love the fight sports, that love the martial arts, how can we use this as a tool to combat an authoritarian discipline?
I think it's extremely important and very doable. Like, it's not like a strange concept that we need to bend over backwards to figure it out. I mean, it's because, as you point out, there have been people like that, like Kano in that sense. If you look even in Brazil, people like Osvaldo Fada, the opposite of the Gracies on so many levels. I think we just need to do it more and shine the spotlight more on that. But to me, start with the idea that the thing that the average insecure teenager the reason why most people start martial arts, I feel insecure, I crave a sense of empowerment, I crave a sense of discipline, I want to feel strong in my body, I want to feel confident, all that basic stuff. Yes, 100% yes, and we should offer that through combat sport, through working out, through whatever kind of physical pursuit that combines those things with, while also reminding people that the whole point of this, you become stronger and more disciplined, ultimately because you want to be a better human being. If you become stronger and more disciplined and you remain a complete asshole, now you are a strong and disciplined asshole, which is not a win for anybody else. It's like strength and disciplines are extremely important, are fantastic, but they need to be combined they need to be put at the service of something even better. It's like, yeah, those are the first great couple of steps you need. But the real game gets to when you get to step 3, 4, 5, when you put it at the serving of being a kind human being, where your strength is what allows you to deal with horrific life circumstances and still not turn into an asshole to the people around you. Your perseverance, your endurance is what allows you to take a lot of shit that life is gonna throw your way and still in the because we all, when we are frustrated, when we're hurt, when we're tired, so much easier to snap at people, to be edgy, to be mean, because we're suffering. To me, what real strength is being so strong that you can get kicked around by life and still find that ability to be kind to other people. And so to me, that's part of the message that's really important is, no, you don't need to go to that fascist down the street to learn about strength and toughness and all of these other qualities. Absolutely, you need them. But again, they are part of a package with other stuff. They are not me coming to dominate the universe and screw everyone else kind of approach. That's not strength. And so I think in that sense, it becomes almost just better marketing, reminding people what real strength is, that what they fall for is like the step 1 and 2 of strength, that ultimately there's still so much insecurity behind it that is masking behind something else and putting on a facade of strength. Real strength, and you show examples of this, That's to me is how you play it, whether anything you teach, whether it's a traditional martial art, whether it's a combat sport, whether it's lifting weights, whether it's anything, can be any physical discipline that allow to teach those kind of values.
So between the three of us, we have probably 100 years of combat sports experience. So clearly, we are lifetime aficionados and practitioners of combat sports. That being said, in the modern example, certainly the combat sports community skews very heavily to the right. What about historically? I can think of in the German examples, the Hitler Youth, they had these big staged battles that were basically training to be soldiers. Certainly, Umberto Eco talks about the sharpshooting or the target shooting leagues that were popular under fascist control in Italy. What about other combat sports? Are you aware of, boxing or fencing to turn young boys into men through combat in fascist examples? And then later we'll try and talk about how this doesn't need to be just a fascist thing.
I mean, I think that was part of this cult of masculinity that, or again, a certain idea of masculinity, so that every other movement that I've tried to build the image of the strong leaders will also tend to emphasize things like that. They're not the only guys. Again, there are people from completely different. Well, never mind, you're still talking totalitarians, but it's not exactly like Soviet communism wasn't pushing stuff like that. Absolutely pushing this idea from a very left wing perspective at the other extreme, but very much from a left wing perspective. I think the interesting thing for those of us who don't want to join Stalin and at the same time don't want to join fascism is offering other viewpoints on this. And I think, of course, it's easier when you have a gigantic authoritarian state apparatus behind it to push a certain message. So I think there's a bit of confirmation bias of why we hear so much about it in a certain direction, because also there's a power that goes with it from the state that gets to be pushed in certain ways. But I'm sure it happened to you guys as well, where you're talking to people with whom you agree with certain ideas, and they are pleasant and they are nice, and then you bring up some of the things they are engaged in, and they look at you like, "Whoa, you are a freak." And I'm like, "No, just because I like punching my friends in the face every now and then, that doesn't mean anything. That's it makes you a better human being." But at the same time, is how you communicate it. Like to me, one of the coolest thing in martial art teaching is when you take somebody who's not the tough, strong kid to begin with, or the one who's a great athlete. You take somebody who's scared of their own shadows. You take somebody who's not naturally drawn to combat sport in the slightest, and you slowly start working on something where they do feel empowered, they do feel stronger, they do feel all those things not in a macho way, just as part of a natural progression of how you teach things. And I think that's extremely important to remind people that the hardcore macho approach is one approach to that stuff. It's not the only one. And that ultimately strength is something that anyone needs. I don't care if you are a housewife with 3 kids. Well, you need to be strong as a housewife with 3 kids. And I don't mean just physically, just even in terms of personality. You need to be your sweetness, and I think, sorry if I'm rambling here, but I think an important point that came to mind is that a lot of this has to do with a virus of the human mind where we think in such dualistic terms that the average sweet housewife with 3 kids is going to think that if she becomes stronger, tougher, all of those qualities, then she's going to lose the thing that she values, the sweetness, the nurturing, because the idea is you can be both. And that's a dumb idea because of course you can be both. Of course you should be both because if anything, one feeds the other. Strength without kindness and nurturing, you're just a bully. Kindness and nurturing without strength, first time reality looks at you mean, you're gonna flinch and freak out and no longer even be able to be that kind because you're being intimidated by life. So to me, it's not about telling you you have to become something else, throw away your girly novels and now become a real man. It's like a bunch of people don't want that, and rightfully so. It's like, no, no, no. enjoy whatever it is that you enjoy, cry at movies, do your thing, and also become strong. I think that's a incredibly important thing that we need to highlight time and time again, because most people are addicted to dualism. So they think that in order to gain the thing that combat sports offer, they have to give up all these other sides of themselves that they value. And that's obviously a completely mistaken perception.
You just ably described, honestly, you just summed up what it's all about for me. It's about taking people that need this in their life, that need to be stronger, that need to be more resilient, that need to be more mentally tough, and that would really enjoy the practice of martial arts and building them up. It takes no skill to take a Division I athlete who's already done a combat sport and may turn them into a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. And if you're not careful about the type of folks that you're teaching, you're not creating stronger people, you're creating more efficient predators. And I'm not trying to create more efficient predators. Two things about that. First, it's 1,000 times more rewarding to take someone who is a housewife who's never done something like this before, or someone who's never done a sport and so isn't physically strong, doesn't believe themselves capable of this. It's 1,000 times more rewarding. And this is why, if you're listening to this and you're a gym owner, one of the things that we've done at my school that I think is most important is we have big bay windows that show every class we do. Because how do people know that they can love this if they don't see it happen? And if they see it happen and they're like, I could do that. If they watch the UFC, a lot of people are going to say like, man, I don't want to do that. Understandably, not everybody should do MMA, but like there are martial arts that everybody can do. And so having that kind of transparency is I think, very important. And the second thing I wanted to say is that there are some values that I think should be universal values. Hard work, discipline, taking being accountable to other people, avoiding bullying. And it's interesting that these universal values have been sort of co-opted by a lot of bad actors. And I think, like, I always try to reframe those things as leftist values. Like, we are, all about hard work, taking responsibility, being accountable. We want to be good people doing a hard thing well. And the last thing I wanted to say that's very nerdy is what you said about dualism, right? About you got to be one thing or another. It's a binary outcome. You are either masculine or you are not masculine. This is a thing that came up in fascism. And Martin Heidegger was the official philosopher of the Nazi Party. He was the rector of Freiburg University. And he was very into that there was this bygone era where there was a way of being. And one of my favorite philosophical works that I really think we need to bring back is Theodor Adorno's book, The Jargon of Authenticity, where he argues essentially it's an extremely dangerous thing to harken back to an era where you have to be authentically this. There are a lot of ways to be a man. There are a lot of ways to be masculine. There's a lot of ways to be a woman. And the world is not as binary as we were led to believe it is. And so every time I hear someone talk about, you know, authenticity in things like toughness or masculinity, it's something that makes me give them a second glance.
And I think it's important to highlight that. It's important to me to, if you are tough because you have done a lot of things in your life that have built toughness, it's important to remind people that I cry at playing video games and every other movie makes me, I watch Thai commercials and I cry for 2 days. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not in contradiction. It's not in, if anything, it makes you more interesting human being, the fact that you can relate on many different levels to life. And at the same time, that can also provide a model to people who have been built with this approach to macho toughness. Like I remember I had a student once who was not martial arts student in college, came from straight up ghetto, right? South Central LA, dead people on his block on a regular basis, kind of thing. So obviously the thing he valued were built a bit on the you have to defend yourself in every situation, toughness, you need to be, because his environment was one where there were threats at every corner. And he clearly, in studying things we're doing in school, he clearly was interested in a lot of things that were more nerdy and intellectual and things that did not fit, that if he told the people in his neighborhood, they would look at him like, what's happening to you, kind of thing. And I think the time when the light switch went on for him, that he was okay to be into these things, was one time when he did come to train with me. and we're sparring. And of course, he's not, a trained martial art. He's trained a little, but he's not a trained martial artist. So he goes way harder in sparring than he should. And at one point, he nails me with a pretty good punch. And then I just take him down, take his back, and choke him out, right? And I see like the lights went on in him, like pure love, right? He was like, my God. So when you talk about books and the nerdy shit that I actually like, it's not because you're gonna, I'm not gonna turn gay just because I'm into this stuff. It's like you just did the thing that a real man does. So that means maybe I can open my mind a little bit to that type of stuff. And I think is important because, I'm not going to convince him by having a conversation with him that goes against everything that he has been raised with. Is by you show a different side. You show is like, hey, if we want to play that game, I can play that game. But also now that we have established that we can respect each other in that field, let's look at something else that maybe is slightly beyond your normal comfort zone. And initially it's going to start small, and then that window can open up in terms of somebody's mental ability to allow for the fact that there may be multiple things that come together in creating a human being, that you don't have to be a walking, breathing stereotype.
I love the idea of using martial arts in conjunction with other things to show that masculinity in this case is multifaceted. However, there are a lot of people who used to train jiu-jitsu. Those are mostly the people I'm in touch with who quit, say, during COVID, or quit because their club went completely fascist and are now adrift. They're messaging me from Mississippi and they go, every club within 100 miles is outright fascist. And there's other people who want to start the sport, but they go onto Instagram and they go take a look at Gordon Ryan's feed or Tom DeBlass's feed or Renzo Gracie's feed. And they're like, holy shit, I want nothing to do with this sport. And unless they're lucky enough to live in Bellingham or to live close to Rough Hands BJJ or to live close to a relatively small handful of clubs that are explicitly anti-fascist, how the hell are they supposed to start training? Like, what would your advice? Actually, this is for both of you. What would your advice be to that person who wants to either get back into training and is put off by the rather massive tilt to the alt-right that most clubs have done, or people who want to get started and are put off by the rather massive and obvious tilt to the alt-right that clubs have done?
If you want to start it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would answer that in three ways. The first is there are more good clubs now than ever. And yeah, and that's a function of the growth of the art. And yes, there are many, many bad clubs out there, but if you look hard enough, unless you're in a super rural area, you will probably be able to find a place that is at least not fully against your values. Second, I think it's extremely valuable to engage in those spaces. There are some things that are a lost cause, right? You're not going to change the minds of some of the people that you mentioned, Stefan, right? We are fully baked at a certain point. But I think a lot of folks, what we need to get back to is a mainstream where there is a center that can hold, and then we agree on the shared set of facts and values, and we are able to influence each other. Like there are people at my club that do not agree with me politically, but for me, like I think engaging with those folks on a respectful level and like being a voice, even if your club does not fully share your values, you being at space and an example of, hey, this guy's cool. I've trained with him. He sat under my mount for 5 minutes and didn't give up. I respect him now. I think there's a lot of value there. And the third and final thing is that this is how we create networks. And what I mean by networks is not even like certainly not jujitsu networks, but networks of communication where the speed of media communication these days is the root of a lot of these problems. There's a reason that the fascists attack the mainstream media because it destroys the center and we get into our silos. But I think that if we do this thing we love and demonstrate who we are to people, I don't think it fixes everything by any means. But I also do think that if we don't do it, I don't think things are going to get better.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think in piggybacking on that notion, I think sometimes, if you have the place that fits your values, that's great. But honestly, if the only place in town is like a rabid fascist place, and assuming that it's safe enough in the sense that, it's not just, they still run a professional academy in the sense that they don't just snap crazy arm bars where top people. So you don't go into training thinking that you're going to get horrendously injured, because otherwise, yeah, you really shouldn't. But if it's run professionally, and my main opposition is that I find their ideology is poisonous, screw it. I'll go train with those guys. I don't care. Because to me, in an ideal world, it would be nice to have a pleasant community with people that you train with. But in a less ideal world, at the end of the day, I'm there for a few purposes. I'm there to gain certain skills, practical and psychological. And I don't need to like the person I'm training with to gain those skills. I understand that there are limits. I'm not going to join into some dumb conversation. I'm not going to try to convert anybody. I'm just there for a purpose. I'm there to gain certain skills, and I can gain the skills rolling with some fascists. That doesn't really change my ability to gain what I'm there to gain. And so, in that sense, I don't personally have a problem training with people I don't like.
I think some people are just more allergic to that than others, and that may be a disposition that may be a learned thing. I'm not sure.
If you tell me, do you want to pay money to go into a space with people you really despise to spend some time with them? It's like, doesn't sound like the greatest idea. So I can sympathize with that point of view. You know what I mean? But then you have to remember, what am I doing it for at the end of the day? Yeah, it would be nice to have some pleasant social life. Not going to happen in that place. Do you still want to learn what you can get from that type of activity? If I think is valuable, if I think is important, I'm not going to let the fact that some of my training partners are idiots stop me from doing that. It's like I'm aware of what the limitations are. I'm gonna put on a certain level of screen and then just go in because I'm there to do a job. I'm there to get something out of it. The end. Sorry, one more thing. As Jeff was saying, which is important, is you do get sometimes the fact that people then like you as a person because you're a good training learner. And that maybe, just maybe, their rabid idea about people who don't fit their ideological mold mellow out a little bit. They are not going to change their mind. They're not going to suddenly, but maybe they are 5% less hardcore about it because now in their brain there's the possibility that there are exceptions to whatever stereotype they're holding. That doesn't hurt either.
That would be a little bit like the well-known phenomenon that the thing that changes somebody's mind most about LGBT issues is having somebody in your family that you find out is LGBT. I mean, Dick Cheney is a horrific human being, but the one redeeming factor of Dick Cheney is that he wasn't LGBT, anti-LGBT. Why? Because his daughter was LGBT. So all of a sudden, this horrific human being did pivot on this one issue, and the majority of people who are just freaked out by this trans threat have never actually interacted with a trans person. So I think there is this kind of, it's a little bit of a virus. Like, well, shit, I like training with Daniele, but he's not, he doesn't like Trump, does not compute.
Right. Yeah, and I think I mean, you're not doing it as a missionary kind of thing. That's more like a side benefit if it happens. You're going there because you want to train and you want to get something out of it. And then on the plus side, it may work out like that you can slightly open somebody's mind to the idea that the stereotypical view of reality that they dearly hang on to may not be 100% accurate.
The other thing I've recommended to people who just cannot cross that chasm for whatever reason is in the modern day and age, you can buy a bunch of mats and you can train with a bunch of friends. And so long as every once in a while, once a month, once every couple months, you make the pilgrimage to go train at, quote, a legit club to calibrate your skills, you can make an awful lot of progress on your own in your garage. If you're willing to train hard, if you're willing to train intelligently, and if you're willing to occasionally test yourself. If you think you're a blue belt, great. Go train at a club that has a bunch of blue belts and see how you do against them. That is a possibility now for the people who just can't, for whatever reason, financially support some club that's got a great big MAGA and Confederate flag flying in front of it.
100%.
So Daniele, if people want to partake of the stuff that you put on the internet, what's the best way to do that?
I think probably History on Fire is a good start. That's if you're into history. If you're not, of course, that doesn't apply. But History on Fire, yeah, I do deep dives on various historical events. I try to keep this as non-ideological as humanly possible because I'm not trying to. I mean, also to me, that's like the way to actually do history is like you're not trying to fit an ideological preconceived view of how life played out or I have my beliefs, but at the end of the day, life is complicated and history is complicated, and I like to keep it that way. So yeah, big deep dives on a whole variety of historical topics. I started using more and more recently out of all the various poisonous social media platforms. I'm beginning to dig Substack a bit because it just becomes a place for essays and other things that I feel like sharing in an environment that's a little. So Substack I'm enjoying. I do have a Substack and pretty much most everything is free. So nobody needs to pay for it. I do have like bonus episodes of History on Fire there that I put out every month for like $5 a month or something. But the bulk of like I haven't put a single essay behind the paywall. Like all the writing stuff is all it's all free. So that's another way that people can check out some stuff, see if they like it or not. And I think those are probably good entry points. By that point, after that many hours of History of Fire, you'll be speaking with an Italian accent in your head and everything. So that's plenty right there.
Also, if you like martial arts and if you're watching this, I don't know why you wouldn't. You should buy his book, On the Warrior's Path. I'm going to get a bookshelf like Stefan and put that behind me, like Stefan's book, Perseverance.
Great. Thank you. Thank
What?
you.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, it's there. I hadn't
Yeah.
noticed. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys, and good luck with your training. And I'm going to go lift some weights because pinko commie leftist fascists also need to get strong.
Thank you so much. This was awesome conversation.
Thank you, guys.